In this video, we're going to tell you everything you need to know about Darkseid, a force from the beginning. Darkseid is a character that stands out as one of DC Comics' headlining villains. He's a figure created by none other than Jack the King Kirby, making his debut within the pages of Superman's pal, Jimmy Olsen, issue number 131 all the way back in 1970. Darkseid was set up to be a threat right from the get-go. In a nutshell, this dreadlord is simply bad to the bone, with his most distinct ability coming in the form of his trademark Omega Beams, a pair of laser-like projectiles he shoots from his eyes, which have the ability to send its target to anywhere and anywhen in DC's Multiverse, among some other things. This ability is arguably one of DC Universe's most feared powers. Not only can Darkseid manipulate the laws of space-time with it, but he can straight up use these fearsome beams to just wipe its target from the face of the multiverse. Make no mistake, it doesn't just take you out, it erases you, as if you never existed at all. The Omega Beam is just one of the manifestations of Darkseid's abilities. The true source of Darkseid's abilities stem from a mysterious cosmic force known as the Omega Effect. And although the extent of the Omega Effect's potential hasn't been fully explored, despite Darkseid being around for more than half a century now, what's clear is that it grants this supervillain command over the very laws of the universe itself. His truly formidable powers aside, one has to ask, how did Darkseid become one of DC Universe's most fearsome villains? The multiversal threat who would one day be known as the Dread Darkseid started life on the grim realm of Apokolips, a planet within a realm called the Fourth World, ruled over by despotic deities. Apokolips is not a great place, to say the least. For one, most of its citizens are either slaves that the planet's ruling class had abducted and sent there. For another, a grotesque species known as the parademons make up most of Apokolips's military might. And then, of course, there's Darkseid and his kin, beings that are as close to gods in the DC universe as one can possibly get. You wouldn't even be mistaken to think that they are indeed a new generation of deities born into the multiverse. Darkseid's home planet stands in stark contrast to their counterparts on the planet New Genesis, but as with the Dreadlord himself, most, if not all, of New Genesis citizens belong to the same race as him, a category of deities known as the New Gods. But before he was even called Darkseid, this villain used to be a little Apokolips prince named Uxas. Born to the then sovereigns of Apokolips, the Queen Hegra and King Yuga, you can argue that the boy was built for the traditions of this horrible planet. Growing up, Uxas only wanted one thing: the complete and utter rule of the Apokolips realm. The problem was the planet's royalty went by the laws of primogeniture. That was the firstborn son of the royal line would be the one to succeed its predecessor. And well, Uxas had an older sibling, a brother named Drax. Unlike Uxas, Drax was more of a maverick by Apokolips standards, in that he leans more towards peace and prosperity than the traditional warlike tendencies of its ruling class. So Uxas bided his time. Along the way, he would also make his way to New Genesis, the home of their rival gods. There, he met a boy around the same age as himself. Now, this boy was more or less a regular old citizen of New Genesis. He was peaceful, pacifistic, and one might even say innocent and naive. But Uxas managed to unleash the boy's inner darkness by the way of a crafty plan involving their respective pets, Uxas' bird and the boy's cat. Long story short, this encounter ended with the boy wringing the bird's neck. In turn, this allowed Uxas to corrupt him after the dark little prince noticed his potential for pure savagery. From there, Uxas would take the boy under his wing, taking him away from his native New Genesis to become Darkseid's advisor and chief torturer when he finally took over this hellish planet. A dark ascent. Now, Uxas's ascent to power went into full motion when his older brother Drax was just about to claim his birthright. This birthright came in the form of immersion with the so-called Omega Realm. Drax was supposed to be the one gifted with this formidable blessing, the Omega Effect. But Uxas, being the ambitious noble that he was, went ahead and wormed his way into the Omega Realm's ritual. This resulted in Drax's apparent demise, and Uxas claiming these cosmic energies for himself. Uxas emerged a short time after the ritual completed, and he'd rename himself as Darkseid from then on. And while Uxas, or Darkseid's mom, Queen Hegra, couldn't be more pleased with what her younger son just did. This is Apokolips after all, and might is right. In fact, she had dreaded the day that Drax would assume the throne, given that he was too soft for their family's standards. But don't worry about his dad either, because he went missing in the so-called Source Wall long before this all happened. Now, the Source Wall is basically this boundary that separates existence from non-existence in the DC Multiverse. With Darkseid now in possession of one of the most fearsome powers, he wasted no time to make full use of the perks that came with it. His first move was to take out all their rival new gods from New Genesis. To do this, Darkseid and Steppenwolf, who was both his uncle and the head of Apokolips' military might, traveled to New Genesis with one goal: to hunt down any and all new gods they could find for the sheer thrill of it. It was a success, all things considered. That's because they may not have wiped out the gods of New Genesis right then and there, but they ended up taking out one of the planet's greatest symbols, Avia, New Genesis' queen and wife of its sovereign Highfather. As revenge, the Highfather took out Steppenwolf, and this ultimately brought Darkseid to his new goal, as this encounter ignited what would be seemingly internal war between New Genesis and Apokolips. On top of that, Steppenwolf's death didn't take. Darkseid brought him back to life not long after the Highfather took him out. Along the way, Hegra would make some power moves to ensure her son's transition to becoming Apokolips' ruler was in line with the family's dark traditions. So she set up a marriage between Darkseid and a highborn lady named Tigra. Hegra had thought that this was the perfect match, considering that Tigra herself was just as Weasley and ruthless as tradition demanded. But if there's one thing we can count on, it's Darkseid was gonna do what he wanted to do. Instead of being a good boy and following his mom's orders, the young Dreadlord fell for another woman named Sully. It doesn't look like a bad match at first glance. On one end you have a precocious, well-educated lady of good standing and a legitimate noble on the other. That is, until we find out that Sully wasn't exactly your typical Apokolipsian. She got it into her head that ideas of peace and pacifism were much more preferable to the planet's conquest-hungry ways. In fact, Darkseid fell so hard for her that it eventually led to the birth of a son named Kalibak. Of course, Hegra wasn't having any of this. Unlike the good queen regent that she was, Hegra immediately made arrangements for Sully's assassination at the hands of Darkseid, because this royal family was not going to have another soft son like Drax. Let's just say Darkseid learned his lesson to some extent after this whole turn of events. This became apparent when he was next betrothed to a noblewoman named Kariv. This was a purely political arrangement, considering that Kariv's family owned a significant resource that the Apokolipsian royal line wanted for themselves. The plan was for Darkseid to marry this woman, take over her lands and holdings, and then promptly take her out of the picture. But this wouldn't come to pass due to the sudden arrival of Doomsday, whose rampage ultimately forced Darkseid to cancel his planned takeover. So the Dreadlord ended up going with Hegra's original marriage proposal. He married Tigra. This union soon led to another child, Orion, and soon after that, Darkseid would finally learn the truth behind Sully's death. He confronted Darkseid about this and gave the Weasley advisor an ultimatum. It was either he took out Hegra the same way he did Sully, which was by poison, or Darkseid could simply disintegrate him right then and there. Of course, he chose to save his own skin and proceeded to assassinate the Queen Regent. With the throne now wide open, all that was left for Darkseid was to claim it. And claim it he did. From then on, Darkseid became the sole, undisputed ruler of Apokolips. Darkseid would meet a soldier named Goodness, who at the time faced a court-martial for taking out her commanding officer after they ordered her to eliminate Goodness' trusty pet, Mercy, the war dog. Goodness would argue that she refused the order due to the fact that Mercy was the most loyal warhound in their stable. And more than that, Mercy wasn't just loyal to the cause, the beast was exceedingly dedicated to Darkseid himself. Darkseid then tested this theory by ordering Mercy to take out Goodness. In the end, Mercy was forced to eliminate her trusty mount, and this was more than enough for Darkseid to see Goodness as an asset for his regime. As a reward for her loyalty and doing what needed to be done, Darkseid granted Goodness custody over a place called Armageddon's Orphanage. a house where the young children of Apokolips were indoctrinated to become fiercely loyal to Darkseid. As the head of the place, Goodness then established an order of elite guards known as the Female Furies. Now, the ongoing war between Apokolips and New Genesis has reached a stalemate. However, Darkseid would discover what very well might be the element needed to tip the scales toward his favor. This all happened when Darkseid first met the Green Martian race, who believed that existence itself can be attributed to free will, also known as the life equation. This information allowed Darkseid to surmise that there must be an equal, if not more powerful force opposite to this, something dubbed as the anti-life equation. And by acquiring it, Darkseid would finally be able to accomplish his original plan of destroying his hated counterparts on New Genesis. However, Darkseid was no dummy. Instead of continuing the conflict against his rivals, the Dreadlord decided to bide more time in search of his anti-life equation. To make sure that this process went uninterrupted, Darkseid and the Highfather would agree to an indefinite ceasefire. This truce came with a pact where Darkseid and the Highfather would trade each other's sons to be raised as wards of their adoptive parents. This would only be broken if either of these children left Apokolips or New Genesis. So Darkseid sent Orion to his rival's homeworld and in turn received the Highfather's own son. This child was then handed over to Goodness's care and would one day be named Scott-free. So it was more or less a win-win for both sides of the conflict, at least for the time being. The Highfather and New Genesis didn't have to continue losing lives in their brutal war against Apokolips. But on the other hand, Darkseid didn't just get a new kid in the process, but he had now all the time he needed to look for the anti-life equation, and it went really well for him. That is, until this whole pact blew up in his face. That's because there came a time when Scott ultimately managed to escape Apokolips. On top of that, Goodness's ace female fury, Big Barda, fell in love with Scott and decided to join him in his escape from the planet. And if that wasn't enough, Darkseid's own son, Orion, ultimately grew up embodying the ideologies of New Genesis, which effectively turned him into the greatest threat against Darkseid himself. And to top it all off, Darkseid became aware of a certain prophecy that foretold his death at the hands of his son, Orion, a lord of conquest. Darkseid's quest to obtain the anti-life equation eventually led him to the planet Earth, as the Dreadlord believed that its species, humans, collectively held the key to unlocking this weapon. During this era, Earth's greatest superhero, Superman, would serve as Darkseid's most hated foe. But he didn't exclusively stick to fighting with the Big Blue Boy Scout. Along the way, Darkseid would also become aware of the mythical realm of Themyscira, home of Wonder Woman and the Amazons. Given that these warriors were gods in their own right, it was only natural for the Dark Lord to treat them as threats. This all came to a head when Darkseid took it upon himself to invade Olympus, which was basically the command center of the Greek pantheon. A war between the Amazons and the forces of Apokolips broke out that ultimately saw the Amazons triumph, but at a grave cost. It left Themyscira's population decimated. On a brighter note, Wonder Woman was able to considerably weaken Darkseid during this conflict, which she did by transferring a part of her soul within the evil new god. As we mentioned, Darkseid might be one hardcore villain, but he by no means was an idiot. During the Crisis of Infinite Earth storyline, which saw the entire DC Multiverse threatened by the cosmic foe called the Anti-Monitor, Darkseid teamed up with several heroes to prevent the crumbling of existence. Of course, alliances like this were short-lived at best. It was a partnership of convenience, and when that was done, Darkseid immediately went back to antagonizing the world's greatest heroes. In one instance, he was even able to bring Supergirl to his side by means of black kryptonite, a mineral that had the ability to control a Kryptonian's mind. Superman defeated Darkseid, hurling him towards the source wall to stop him forever from messing with the universe. But Darkseid wouldn't be absent in the DCU for far too long. Out with new, in with the end. Sometime later, Darkseid would set his eyes back to his realm when the fourth world neared its destruction. The Dark Lord took this as an opportunity to become the creator of the universe that would come next, angling to remake it according to his whims. Darkseid's quest eventually led him to use Superman's favorite, Jimmy Olsen, to become a conduit of the new god's energies. This move culminated in the intervention of his sworn superhero enemy Superman and a whole sequence that saw Jimmy turning into a Kaiju kaiju turtle to duke it out with Darkseid. But the most striking part of this saga happened when Darkseid's most feared prophecy finally came to pass, because during its climax, Orion would emerge to have one final duel with Darkseid. Orion ultimately fulfilled the prophecy when he straight up drove his hand into Darkseid's chest and ripped out the evil lord's heart. But you can't keep a good villain down for long. After some time, Darkseid would be reborn in the universe. This time, he emerged as a bar owner called Boss Darkseid. Of course, he gotta capitalize on that brand, so he called his joint the Darkseid Club. This super weird adventure was by Grant Morrison and would conclude with Darkseid putting a bullet between Mr. Miracle's head, thinking that the superhero was the avatar of the life equation itself. But don't worry though, he isn't truly gone. He's a career escape artist. Now, all of this would lead to arguably Darkseid's biggest W in the DC universe to date, the Final Crisis storyline. It all started with the death of Orion, which happened when Darkseid decided to get some payback by shooting the guy with the so-called Radion bullet, and soon snowballed into the revelation that Darkseid finally got the thing that he desired the most, the anti-life equation. We'd learn that Darkseid had actually acquired this artifact for some time now and had been using it to create an army of metahumans of his own. Of course, now that he had the anti-life equation, Darkseid moved on to subdue the one planet in the universe that had been a thorn in his side for so long, Earth. He sprang this whole plan to use the anti-life equation on the world by releasing the free will sapping element into the internet. And we're not just making that up. As corny as it sounds, it worked like a charm. Humanity fell under the Dark Lord's boot, with only a few of Earth's greatest heroes remaining active to stop him. The whole storyline would eventually reveal that Darkseid's mere existence was corrupting reality itself, which led to the various versions of Earth within the multiverse folding upon each other to create one single universe. In other words, this was yet another one of DC Comics' attempt at streamlining their fictional world to make it a little bit more coherent. Another reset. Darkseid's grand plans would eventually fall flat, and it all started at the hands of Batman. Specifically, the Dark Knight got hold of the same Radion bullet that he used on Orion and used it to cause massive damage on Darkseid. From there, a few other A-listers like The Flash, Wonder Woman, and Superman would get in on the action and finally put a stop to Darkseid and free the world from the anti-life equation's influence. Now, if you thought that everything that happened until now is crazy, wait until you find out how Superman defeated Darkseid. We hope you're ready for this. Superman beat Darkseid using the power of song. Reality itself had been poisoned by Darkseid's presence. The universe was literally vibrating at Darkseid's frequency, a kind of cosmic death rattle. To fight him, Superman had to think beyond physical strength. That's where the power of song comes in. Using the Miracle Machine, a device that turns thought into reality, Superman realized that sheer willpower wasn't enough. He needed a pure expression of life, harmony, and creation to counterbalance Darkseid's symphony of control and decay. Music, the oldest and most universal expression of hope, became the weapon. So Superman sang, not a top 40 tune, but a resonant frequency carried through his voice and will, amplified by the Miracle Machine. The song represented the living universe pushing back against anti-life. Every note he sang restored order, rekindled light, and shattered Darkseid's grip. Bad reboots, good villains. Now, DC Comics had to spring the New 52 initiative, a company-wide hard reset of all their characters just a few years after the Final Crisis saga. Of course, with this reboot came a new version of Darkseid's origin story. In this version, Darkseid was painted as sort of a revolutionary who stood against the so-called old gods of the universe. You see, the old gods were this group of scummy deities who didn't care about the mortals, but needed their prayers to survive. As before, Darkseid was a young god called Uxas before turning into the Dreadlord, and the High Father was actually his brother. The two would rebel against the old gods, which led them to Yuga Khan, casting them out, their father. Here, Yuga Khan was in possession of the anti-life equation, and he'd meet his end at the hands of Uxas after the young gods stole it and took him out. From there, Uxas absorbed all of the energies of the old gods and dubbed himself Darkseid. Now, DC Comics did tend to complicate what was already convoluted because they'd end up doing another Darkseid reboot while still in the thick of their New 52 initiative. In this version, Uxas and the High Father were still brothers, but instead of starting out as part of the Old Gods pantheon, they sprang from the energies that were left after the Old Gods perished. These new gods' dimension was called Galactica, and the brothers would ultimately become bitter enemies when Uxas took out the High Father's wife, Avia. This then led to a war between the two factions similar to the OG DC Comics continuity until Uxas took a resounding L. He was then banished and would set up shop on Apokolips. Now, the New 52 initiative ran its course, and DC Comics decided to start another initiative called Rebirth. And as you'd expect, another retooled version of Darkseid's origins came along with this. But there's some silver lining though, as it appears this origin for the Dark Lord has managed to stick around as of the making of this video. Darkseid's origin story in this revamped or rebirthed DC Comics mostly plays out like the OG version we saw, with just a dash of New 52 flavor. Here, he was the son of Apokolips sovereigns, Yuga Khan and Hegra, but instead of having Drax as his brother, DC retained the New 52 plot point that Uxas' brother was Isaiah, the High Father. On top of that, Uxas would claim the name Darkseid even before ascending the Apokolips throne in this new continuity. The war between Apokolips and New Genesis was already in full swing even before Darkseid assumed power. Then, there's also the fact that this version of Darkseid got around. He didn't just have a couple kids, he had tons of them. But chief among his offspring were Kalbak and Orion, just like in the original continuity. He would even have a child with a Themysciran in this world, which led to the birth of another notable child of his, Grail. As you might expect, Darkseid got into a whole bunch of adventures in this era. As of this video, Darkseid's most recent exploits involved taking out his own son Kalbak and going on a quest to locate the Spectre. By the end of this storyline, Darkseid would purposely get himself eliminated by the Justice League, which was actually just a ploy to allow himself to be sent to an alternate realm called Elseworld. From there, Darkseid would twist Elseworld according to his own image. In this new domain, the Dark Lord would recover all the power he thought he had lost, and as always, bide his time until he's ready to come back and influence the DCU once more.